the increasing complexities that charities are having to deal with in just being charities in order to go out and do good.
You're listening to Let's Imagine, an Imagine Canada podcast for everyone interested in social issues and the nonprofit sector. I'm your host, Bruce MacDonald. At Imagine Canada, we believe that by leveraging our national vantage point, building cross-sector relationships, and sharing and developing our knowledge base, we can advance social, economic, and environmental justice through our collective action. Join us as we dive deep into conversations that have big implications for the nonprofit and charitable sector here in Canada. A special thank you to our knowledge partner, Carter's Professional Corporation. Together, let's imagine a stronger future. About a year ago, we launched our Let's Imagine podcast. This new forum has provided Imagine Canada with a platform to explore issues of importance to charities and nonprofits. Since the start, we've been fortunate to have the support of Carter's Professional Corporation. And in fact, Terry Carter, the firm's managing partner, was our very first guest. As we're now well into 2024, we've asked Terry to come back and discuss some of the pressing public policy files from last year and those upcoming for this year. Terry, welcome back to the podcast.
Well, thank you, Bruce. Pleasure to be with you again and look forward to our discussion.
Great. Well, let's start with taking a look back at 2023. From your perspective, what were the major legal, regulatory, and or legislative issues that you were hearing about from your clients? What was top of mind?
I think, Bruce, there were three things that stands out in my mind. One was dealing with the confusion surrounding reporting requirements involving express internal trust requiring a T3 to be filed. We had written about it back in June of 23 and pointed out that amendments to the Income Tax Act appeared to require charities to provide separate reporting through a T3 that would have to be done in the early part of 2024 to set out the details of internal express trust, which would involve endowment funds and scholarship funds and other types of restricted funds. Didn't seem to make a lot of sense to us and to the sector because all of that information is covered in T3010s and in the financial statements. So it was brought to the attention of both Finance and Canada Revenue Agency to provide some clarity. It took a fair length of time, Bruce, for that to get clarified. Eventually, Canada Revenue Agency, to their credit, did provide clarity on November the 10th that express internal trust of charities did not require T3 reporting. But there was a good 4 or 5 months where there was a lot of uncertainty concerning it. And there's still some questions that remain about, what is caught by the T3 reporting requirements? So that was number one. Number two is the whole new regime of the qualifying disbursement alternative for working with non-qualified donees. It's a good development, which came about because of Senator Omnivar's initiative back in 2022. There were changes to the Income Tax Act. But the guidance dealing with qualifying disbursements, dealing with grants, came out in November the 30th of 2022. And Canada Revenue Agency was looking for input on the draft that they presented. And we didn't get a final version of the guidance until December, I believe it was the 19th or 18th of 2023. So during that period of time, charities who technically had the ability to do qualified disbursements or grants were generally reluctant, Bruce, to do anything with them because they were waiting for clarity from Canada Revenue Agency. Now we have it, and we can talk about that, but it still was a bit of uncertainty for that period of time. The third area is dealing with the alternative minimum tax. It's very much a going concern issue. It hasn't been resolved yet, which would have negative impact upon giving by individuals. And I know Imagine Canada is doing a great job of covering that on behalf of the sector. So those are the three things, Bruce, that sort of stood out in my mind from 2023.
Absolutely. It was a busy year with a number of those files. And I know from certainly the one on the trust reporting was fascinating because hearing from organizations who this new burden, as it was going to be framed for them would be an incredible amount of work. And so we were really pleased that with working together with folks like yourselves and other organizations, we're able to have that changed. And you mentioned the qualifying disbursements. This has been a long process in terms of a big effort to replace what has been viewed as kind of archaic direction and control rules. So as you mentioned, the final guidance product came out right before the holiday season. From your perspective, what do you see as the major improvements to the way that charities and non-charities can work together? And in the final guidance product, do you see any downsides?
Well, first of all, it's good to have the option of being able to do qualifying disbursements. And for those that may not be familiar with that terminology, it means that a registered charity can make a gift over to a non-registered charity, technically an unqualified donee, provided that the charity is pursuing its purpose by making the gift over or a grant over to the unqualified donee. So it's a good development, and certainly one that the sector have been pushing for, because there are some real limitations with the own activities and direction and control regime. That regime requires that it's a bit of a fiction. You have to sort of pretend that the transfer of monies to a third party, like an unqualified donee, is not really a gift. It's still the program and activities of the transferring charity. And so very awkward and paternalistic and colonial. So it's good to have an alternative. If you choose to do a qualifying disbursement, Bruce, like in the form of a grant, you're going to have to do a fair bit of homework and due diligence before you can team up or work with an unqualified donee. Risk assessments, their accountability, their risk matrix that you have to work through. It really is quite onerous, and I think a lot of charities will find that a bit challenging. Secondly, the T3010 has been amended to require that you have to set out the details of the grants if they're above $5,000, who they go to, the purposes. So there's extra work that's required there. And the qualifying disbursement, Bruce, also involves what's referred to as otherwise making resources available. That's the Income Tax Act. But there's not real clarity of what that means. And the difficulty is, Bruce, when you're doing a transfer that involves, quote, otherwise making resources available, quote, that doesn't count towards meeting a charity's disbursement quota. Many charities don't care, but if you're trying to track your disbursement quota of 3.5 below $1 million or 5% above $1 million, you will need to care. And if you're making a space available to an organization or you're providing volunteers or employees, all of that is sort of otherwise making resources available. You have to be able to qualify it, but it's not going to go towards meeting your disbursement quota. So that's provided some complexity. I think the last challenge that may be worth mentioning at this time, the Income Tax Act has sort of an anti-directed gift provision that basically says that if a charity accepts a gift, that's the granting of which is either expressly or implicitly conditional upon making a gift over to a non-charity, then you can lose your charitable status. And the guidance, Bruce, tries to explain what is meant by that, but it doesn't actually reflect the language in the Income Tax Act, because the Income Tax Act talks about, quote, conditional gifts, and conditional gifts has certain common law meaning, and that's not reflected in the guidance. And also, Bruce, it's a longer document. It's gone from 30 pages to 45 pages, so it's an onerous read to go through. So in a nutshell, it's good to have qualifying disbursements as an option, but it requires more scrutiny, more due diligence. And I think to that extent, it's a little discouraging to see that, because I think the option could have been more easier for charities to work with. And my concern is that charities may be more reluctant to work with it.
Yeah, it's interesting that you actually use the term easier, because if there's a question I often get from organizations as it relates to this particular file, they'll say, has it been made easier for a charity to work with a non-charity? My response at this point is more like, it's not necessarily easier. However, the spirit of the guidance should make the relationships more authentic and more real in terms of being more respectful in terms of working with organizations. But to your point, it's a longer guidance product. There's a lot of nuances to it. And so it's not necessarily an easier process, but hopefully some progress, and we can continue to refine it and provide feedback to CRA as organizations are working through it. So we talked about a couple of things from last year. I think what we'll do now is turn our attention to the year ahead. While it's anyone's guess when the next federal election will take place, work continues to happen to improve the operating environment for charities and nonprofits. Are there one or two key legal or policy files that you're watching for 2024?
Yeah, Bruce, I think there's two areas that I have some concern. One is the increasing complexities that charities are having to deal with in just being charities in order to go out and do good. I gave some examples dealing with the qualifying disbursement regime. Well, another area that we're seeing complexity is with regards to the T3010. New version came out 24. It's a fact that's in place for year ends starting December the 31st of 23. When you get a chance to go through it, there are a lot of changes, Bruce, that are in there that I think are going to be more difficult for charities to deal with. For instance, there's now a separate schedule for the calculation of the disbursement quota. Many charities had difficulties with the few questions that used to be in the T3010. Now there's a schedule, so it helps them to kind of work it through. But it's not easy. You have to make a lot of judgment calls on trying to do allocation of what is administrative, what is charitable. And I think it's going to be a bit of a struggle for charities to work through. In addition, there is a new schedule and a set of questions dealing with qualifying disbursements in the T3010, which have to be carefully looked at. Bruce, there's now questions dealing with donor-advised funds, and CRA's come up with a definition. It's not too bad, but it does have some real legal implications to it. So I think charities that work with donor-advised funds are going to have to work with their professionals to try to figure out how to answer those questions. And then there are questions that have been added for foundations dealing with restricted funds. And those questions, they're not easy. They're not easy to work with. And again, my concern is the complexity will require small charities that otherwise don't always go to an accountant or a lawyer that they may be required to do so in order to get it right. And then finally, there's a question about impact investing. Impact investing is not really a defined term that's normally used with the CRA guidance products, but it is defined or referenced in the guide for the T3010. The definition for impact investing, Bruce, is somewhat different than other terminologies we see in Canada, like social investment in Ontario. It's not the same. So I can see that charities who are thinking, oh, well, we're doing social investment in Ontario. We're complying with the Charities Accounting Act, so that therefore we must be okay at the federal level with the T3010, but the definitions are somewhat different. So that's the first area, Bruce, that I'm tracking is the increased complexity for charities. And then the second area is that the need for charities to have alternative source of income other than just donations or government grants. And that really gets in the whole area of income generation. And income generation, Bruce, as you know, can come from charitable programs such as ticket sales to events and museums and so forth. It can come from investments, and it can come from what is permitted as being related businesses, but there are rules that apply there. And it can come from unrelated business, provided the charity doesn't do it. So you have to sort of move into subsidiary for-profit corporations in order to generate the income that comes from an unrelated business. Charities need to have funds coming through, and it would be helpful to have some clarity, maybe in a single source dealing with income generation of what charities can do and what they can't do. It's an ongoing challenge, Bruce, for them. And I think the sector needs to champion, encourage CRA to provide more flexibility and easier concepts to work with regards to income generation.
Now, these are really helpful. And certainly this last one you raised about income generation and earned income are top of mind issues for so many organizations we talk with who want to have balanced revenue streams that as they see, hopefully not another pandemic, but some kind of disruption to their regular revenue streams, that they're able to withstand those disruptions because they've got a balanced, if you will, portfolio of how their revenues come in. So we've talked a bit about 2023. We've taken a look at some of those early things in 2024 that are on the horizon. So now let's talk about some of those that maybe should be on the list somewhere. You and I were both members of the advisory committee on the charitable sector that reported into the Minister of National Revenue for a couple of years. And In that forum, we were able to think about improvements to the regulatory and legislative environment that would benefit your organization. We've both been away from that group for a bit. As you think about that work and your day-to-day work with charities and nonprofits across the country, for you, what continues to be on the wish list? What legal reforms do you see needing to happen to improve the overall operating environment?
Well, thanks, Bruce, for that question. And you were a great co-chair, and we were sort of the first iteration of the advisory committee on the charitable sector. And kudos to you and to the work of the committee. We produced 3 reports. The year of 2000, when everyone was in sort of lockdown, the committee was very active, and from January through to July, there were 3 reports that came out. And there were some really good recommendations that were reflected in there. One of them deals with the problems with own activities and direction and control, which is now being addressed. But some other recommendations, Bruce, that we haven't yet seen movement on is the need for the Tax Court of Canada to be the court of first instance for denial of registrations and for revocations. Right now, the tax court only deals with appeals dealing with penalties and sanctions. The tax court, Bruce, can deal with matters such as appeals of penalties, and the tax court can hear new evidence, can there be cross-examination, real opportunity to develop some robust case law. But that doesn't apply to revocations or denials of registration. So what we need to have, Canada, Bruce, I think, is the development of made in Canada case law dealing with what charities can do. And so if we had the tax court hearing revocations and refusal to register, I think we would be able to build up, Bruce, a really robust case law that we could then develop and evolve in the concept of charity law in Canada. The second area is the concept of a home in government in Canada. It's important to have that because there is really disconnect, and Bruce, you know about that. Imagine Canada's been a champion of that for years. So a disconnect between various parts of the federal government and a disconnect with the provincial governments. So having whether it's called home in government or a coordinator or a secretariat, it doesn't matter. It needs to be a forum to bring together different interest groups and different government bodies to coordinate, because right now, charities have to deal with a whole bunch of disparate parts of the federal government and provincial government. It's a real challenge for them. And the final thought would be, because we did do a recommendation on income generation, would be to move that particular topic forward.
Great thoughts. And I know that the tax court idea has been around for a while and makes so much sense because it's an opportunity, as you pointed out, to introduce new information into decisions rather than simply have to challenge whether there was an error in law, which is, I think, way more difficult to do. So some great thoughts there. So now, Terry, it's time to go wild. We've talked about the past and the near term and the wish list, but you've been working with this legal framework for many years. If you could radically change one thing about the interaction between the federal government and the charitable and not-for-profit sector, from a legal perspective, of course, what would it be?
Bruce, let's go back to it. Tax court. We need to evolve. Right now, it's not a criticism of Canada Revenue Agency. It's sort of the reality. By default, they're working in a vacuum in trying to provide guidelines, guardrails for what charities can do. So they're looking at whatever case law is available in Canada and elsewhere in other common law jurisdictions, and they're putting together then guidances that come out on a regular basis. And to their credit, they say the guidances are not law. And they're right, they're not law, except they become de facto law. And they become de facto law because we have so little common law, judge-decided decisions that actually create the law. The sector is becoming regulated by administrative decisions, which are having to take the place of court decisions. So I think it would be a game changer to have the tax court be able to create some real law for Canadian charitable sector. And so that's really probably the most important thing, I think, that could change from a legal standpoint. The other factor is our country is made up of provinces and the federal government. It would be nice if there could be some greater coordination. I know that Canadian Bar Association has made some efforts in the past to get to coordination going, but that's tough to do. It really requires folks in government, the politicians, to say, if we've got a sector in Canada that's trying to do good, we need to do whatever we can to facilitate those people, those primarily volunteers and as well as people that work in the sector, to have the tools that they need, not to be impeded with regulatory disparate systems at the provincial level and the federal level. We can do better, Bruce, and we need to do better in order to encourage and support our volunteer and our charitable sector in doing the good work that they do.
Yeah, these are some great thoughts, Terry. Now, you and I have talked a bit about the tax court idea and the context in which it's situated in the past. It was really illuminating for me when you think about the rest of Canadian society and how the law continues to evolve, because cases come before judges and juries, decisions are made, precedent is set, and it reflects the day and the times of society.
Yes.
Except in the charitable sector. And that because there's such a vacuum here of cases that are not coming forward, the law is kind of stuck. And to your point, having a more accessible route for charities to be able to go via tax court to bring cases to court, rather, would hopefully get us back in the game of saying the law needs to continue to evolve. It needs to continue to be tested so that it can continue to be relevant in today's world. And so I think that really would be a game changer, I think, if that change were to come about. So Terry, as we sort of close off today's conversation, I just really invite you to think about the work that you do with organizations of different sizes and scopes and in different regions of the country. And as you look ahead, we live in these kind of turbulent times. What gives you hope when you're thinking about working with these organizations and the folks that you have contact with on a regular basis? And you see them in their communities every day trying to improve the well-being of the citizens of those communities. And what gives you hope in terms of the work that they do?
Well, Bruce, I think I can put it into sort of simple terms that working in the charitable sector with folks that want to do good is very fulfilling because they have a passion for the purpose of doing good for others. And it's not a passion of profit. It's not a passion of politics. It's not a passion of power. It's not a passion of person. It's about the purpose. And that goes right back to the common law concept of a charitable purpose, public benefit. We're doing something for others. So having an opportunity to work with people who have a passion for what they do, it's a privilege. It's a wonderful privilege in Canada to be able to do that. I think it reflects the very best that we have to offer in Canada. We have in our charitable and not-for-profit sector. And I just feel very, very fortunate. Talking to people with their visions and helping them to move forward with it, you feel good. It's a high. Not to say that business activities are not a high as well, and I don't mean to be derogatory about that, but it's really a wonderful privilege in working with folks in the charitable sector. So thank you for that question, but passion for the purpose is the way that I would describe our charitable sector and not-for-profit sector in Canada.
Well, here, and thanks for that, Terry, and thank you for taking the time to appear on the Let's Imagine podcast again with us. I always learn so much in terms of having these kinds of conversations. While for many volunteers and day-to-day staff people, they might not understand the parameters, the legal parameters in which the system works, but having folks like you and others who are able to synthesize complex legal issues in ways that we can understand and grasp and move forward on and act on, it's really, really helpful. So thank you again for taking the time and looking forward to keeping this conversation going.
Well, thank you, Bruce. My pleasure to be with you today, and hopefully this has been of some help to your listeners.
Thanks for listening to the Let's Imagine podcast. For full show notes and to subscribe to our newsletter so you never miss an episode, please visit our website, www.imaginecanada.ca. Also, if you really like this episode, we invite you to leave us a 5-star review wherever you listen to this podcast, as this helps other people discover us and engage in these conversations. And again, thanks to our sponsors, Carter's Professional Corporation, for supporting our podcast.